Hi, I'm Oliver, and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. So this has probably been the most requested guide I've had since the beginning of the channel, so I did listen. I know I promised it a long time ago, but it's finally here, a guide to Radiohead. Radiohead are one of the most revered and influential artists of the past 3 decades. They've created music that breaks down genre stereotypes and barriers, and their music is unyielding in its focus and originality. I'll make no bones about it, I'm a massive Radiohead fan, and as such I wanted to make sure that this guide was as in-depth as possible without being a bloated mess, so wish me luck. Radiohead released their 9th LP, A Moon-Shaped Pool, in May of last year and captured the world over again with a dark and emotive record. But really we need to start at the beginning somewhere, don't we? Radiohead formed in Abingdon, Oxfordshire in England. And the story begins at school in 1985 with a bunch of mates deciding to start a band. Those mates consisted of Tom York, Johnny and Colin Greenwood, Ed O'Brien and Phil Selway. The band was originally called On a Friday because they practiced on a Friday. Very clever. Interestingly, an early demo of the band, I think dated around 1986, was uploaded a couple of years ago, allegedly by a fellow student at Abingdon School. And it's intriguing to listen to, not because it's particularly good by any means. I mean, they were a sixth form band at the time, so it's probably not going to be particularly great. But you can hear some of those really early key influences. You can hear the Smiths, the Cure, the Talking Heads, and there's even a lot of saxophone influence early on as well. I mean, at one point, the band had 3 saxophonists as part of their lineup. So yeah, it's an interesting to hear some of this early genesis of their sound, even though it's entirely different from even their first LP. And I genuinely think Lemming Trail's a pretty catchy track, link down below. Although everyone except Johnny left for university and went their separate ways, the band continued to meet up and practice and rehearse at weekends and school holidays, and eventually reformed in 1991. There are a couple more tape demos kicking around from around this time, and there's a really strange mixture of styles. They were obviously trying to find their sound at the time. Fuck, you have to listen to the track Dance Sucker, which is this weird dub track with Tom snarling over the top of it. Yeah, bizarre. Also, the track The Greatest Shindig in the World is a really early version of Maquiladora, which is quite interesting to hear the genesis of that song. They were playing gigs around Oxfordshire and Oxford and gaining a little bit more attention locally until they released a new tape which had Stop Whispering on it, which was a future US single for the band and also makes up part of the track listing on their first LP. Around this time, Chris Hufford saw them live and took quite a big interest in them and managed them through their next tape, which was the Manic Hedgehog tape. I'll do a link down below, and eventually guided them to their recording contract with EMI, which was 6 records. This is where the band changed their name from On a Friday to Radiohead, named after the Talking Heads track Radiohead, and this is where the legacy begins in earnest. And so the first release under the Radiohead name was 1992's Drill EP. It had early versions of You and Thinking About You, as well as the tracks Stupid Car and Prove Yourself. This prefaced the first Radiohead studio LP, 1993's Pablo Honey. Okay, so first off, Pablo Honey gets a lot of flack from fans and critics alike for being generally quite simplistic, not very imaginative, pretty crappy basically. Now I'm going to contest this, not because I think that Pablo Honey is some kind of masterpiece. It certainly has its flaws, it's pretty rough around the edges and not particularly well realised. But I think the problem with it is people now compare this record to the spate of incredible records that come from 95's The Bends and onwards, when really you need to view this record for what it is, which is the early genesis of a band that haven't quite found their style yet. And for what it is, I think it's a fairly solid 90s alt-rock record. Yeah, it has its flaws, but it's got catchy tracks on it. There is a level of confidence to their songwriting, although it's not quite at that level yet. But it's not a terrible record, I don't think. Opening track You goes harder than you might expect with this distorted guitar drive, which drops out when Tom's vocals appear, and then Tom's vocals drop out as the guitar appears again. And it's this nice call and response which creates a nice dynamic contrast, which is what reminds me of those early 90s alt-rock bands. I mean, it reminds me of bands that use dynamic contrast, like bands like the Pixies and Sonic Youth. I think a lot of this is down to the work of Sean Slade, who actually co-produced Pablo Honey. He'd worked with bands like Hole and Dinosaur Jr. and Pixies themselves, so I think naturally in the recording process the use of dynamics probably came out more in the songwriting. Of course, Creepers on this record, a track that the band are most well known for in the mainstream, and also a track that's always requested by drunken, shouting idiot plebeians at every festival Radiohead has ever played. I've always had a soft spot for the track Anyone Can Play Guitar. It's quite infectious, and it moves from paranoia to this giddy chorus where Tom sings, "And if the world does turn, and if London burns, I'll be standing on the beach with my guitar. I want to be in a band when I get to heaven. Anyone can play guitar, and they won't be a nothing anymore." Final track, Blowout, manages to throw off some of that unsure restraint that exists on a lot of the tracks on this record, and it has a kind of confidence. It builds to this Sonic Youth-esque wall of noise at the end. It is a really great track. It wasn't really a successful record, it was largely ignored, and it took a long time for Creep to gain some more success for the band. But when they did gain that success, it was a fairly stratospheric rise for them. You know, out of nowhere they were playing local gigs around the UK, and then all of a sudden Johnny, Tom, Colin, Ed and Phil were catapulted off to America and all around the world playing the tracks from Pablo Honey and obviously Creep, which was the main reason that they were there. We still have some other material around this time. There's the infamous single Pop Is Dead. Just go and listen to it. And the Itch EP, which contained a couple of live tracks. Worth checking out, I think, is the track Banana and Co. It did eventually appear again on the Street Spirit EP a couple of years later, but it's cool to hear it in its live form, I think. And this is a track all about the exploitation of the Latin America export trade. So some interesting political stances here, which will end up coming out and forming more of a part of Radiohead's sound and identity years down the line. So with the success of Creep hot on their tails, they jumped back into the studio with producer John Leckie to record the My Iron Lung EP, and a guy called Nigel Godrich was engineering on this. Now Nigel eventually becomes the sole producer of all the Radioheads from OK Computer onwards, and essentially is known as the sixth member of Radiohead. You know, his production is crucial to many of the records that Radiohead go on to release, and he is in many ways a sixth member of the band. Also, this is the first artwork created by honorary seventh member of Radiohead, Stanley Donwood. His art again forms a large part of the identity of the band. I love his artwork. He's a beautiful artist. He manages to create vistas and scapes and these strange abstract pieces of imagery that really just capture the essence of the band's sound. So you should definitely check out more of his work if you've only seen the album art. Worth checking out from that EP is The Trickster, with a chorus that Muse seem to have stolen and reused for their entire sonic footprint. Sorry, Muse fans. Then, in '95, we get The Bends, a record that entirely embodies the confidence that Blowout was hinting at on Pablo Honey, and manages to straddle the line between crowd-pleasing anthems and intelligent, nuanced songwriting. By all accounts, their first brilliant record. Opening track Planet Telex announces the bold new sound of the band, from Johnny's effects-laden guitar and Phil's brazen drum beat just before Tom's unmistakable vocal arrives. This time it doesn't feel like he's feeling around for a vocal style like it did sometimes on Pablo Honey and some of the other tracks from that era. It feels like he's occupying a space that he's comfortable with, and his vocal range suits as well. Dynamically, the record is very different from Pablo Honey, and they move away from that loud and quiet dynamic that was going on at early 90s alt rock sound, and instead they opt for a more expansive stadium-like sound. I think that's most apparent on The Bends, the title track, where you've got Tom singing "I Wish That Something Would Happen," and the band just builds up to that triumphant finale where Tom finally sings "I Want to Be Part of the Human Race." I think this is a good time to note the influence that Johnny has had on the music of the band. You know, his expression and his playing style, even on an album as conventional as The Bends, it really elevates the songwriting to a higher level, I think. And don't get me wrong, I think every single member of Radiohead brings their own crucial qualities to the band, but I do think that Johnny's expression and his approach to playing really, especially on The Bends, really pushes the songwriting from what could sound like a relatively I don't know, I suppose a little bit trite. It's quite conventional record, but it really gives it an edge. Johnny even once said, recording used to be a chore until halfway through the bends. This is where his experimentation began, and you can almost hear his enjoyment coming out through that aggressive lead line of Just, or the washed out melancholy of Bulletproof, I Wish I Was. Everything just sounds purposeful here and well placed. There's a vitality and a confidence and a belief from Johnny and the band that this material is damn good. And it is damn good. The striking Black Star is one of my favourite tracks here. It's a track that lyrically expresses the difficulty of being in love with someone who suffers from mental instability. I get home from work and you're still standing in your dressing gown. Well, what am I to do? I know all the things around your head and what they do to you. What are we coming to? What are we gonna do? Blame it on the Black Star. Blame it on the falling sky. Blame it on the satellite that beams me home. Final track, Street Spirit Fade Out, is a dark, depressing track. It's sophisticated but melancholic in its insistence of futility. Just Tom talking about playing the track live just proves the power of it, I think. It hurts like hell every time I play it, looking out at thousands of people cheering and smiling, oblivious to the tragedy of its meaning. Like when you're going to have your dog put down and it's wagging its tail on the way there. As a side note, check out the track Talk Show Host, which came from the Street Spirit single release. It's a creeping, slithering track that simmers with menace, and it was a track that was eventually used as part of the Romeo and Juliet soundtrack, the Baz Luhrmann film. Oh yeah, and I can't forget this, one of my favourite unreleased tracks from around this period is the track Lift. This was played live a few different times and it turned up a few years later, but it just wasn't quite the same version. The version you want to check out is the 1996 Pink Pop version, link down below. Just listen to those glorious backing vocals from Ed and it will all become clear to you. In June of 1997, Radiohead released their third LP, OK Computer, a record that's considered not only their greatest by many people, but also considered one of the greatest records of all time. This is an expansive, experimental feat of a record that has gone on to inspire countless musicians, creators, artists. It defined the mid-90s and in many ways it changed the face of the way people see music. And that might sound like a supposition, but it's true. Collins said this in an interview around the time of release. It's not the Bends the sequel or the prequel, but there is a continuity. You don't get the feeling we've ripped up all the songs from the Bends and reinvented ourselves in a horribly pop-tastic way. Collins' own pulsating, glitchy bass motif is really what captures me on opening track Airbag, and it works rhythmically alongside Phil Selway's ever-dependable tight drum groove. And this rhythm section, this tight rhythm section, allows Johnny and Ed to create a boundless swirl of guitar atmos. Tom's lyrical line here is one of the most iconic and one of my personal favourites. In an interstellar burst, I'm back to save the universe. This actually refers to a car accident that Tom experienced, and this lyrical content engenders a kind of morbid catharsis, haunting and mesmerising. Second track, Paranoid Android, is one of Radiohead's longest, clocking in at 6 minutes 27, and it's a sprawling triptych of a track. The reason I call it that is because there's three very distinct sections. You have the eerie, the straight-up aggression, and then the almost spectral quality of the finale. It's one of Radiohead's greatest songs, from the unmistakable penetrative falsetto of Tom's vocals to that iconic guitar riff that begins clean, but then when it's repeated again, it's distorted and it just sears through the sonic landscape. OK Computer is a record that establishes the band's interest in geopolitics and environmentalism. It's one of the most interesting facets of Radiohead as a band, I think, and it comes across so clearly on the track Electioneering, which does come across as a critique of Tony Blair's New Labour Party, a party which defined the political landscape of Britain in the late 90s. Tom spits these lyrics: riot shields, voodoo economics, it's just business, cattle prods, and the IMF. This goes perfectly alongside the jangly, abrasive instrumentation pierced through by Phil's cowbell and bright caustic cymbals. Every track on this record is flawless and original. I could talk about it for hours, but I don't have time. But I do want to talk about Exit Music for a Film, because it's a track that, for me, really cements the unbridled talent that this band has. Everything about this track is perfect. The billowing scape behind Tom's vocals, the gentle acoustic guitar, the raspy rasping bass, the climbing strings. It's definitely true that this record pushed the boundaries of what a rock record was, experimenting on tracks like Fitter Happier with this disembodied robotic voice listing the ills of society, and ending on that controversial lyric, a pig in a cage on antibiotics. But really, the experimentation, I think, is not what makes this album stand the test of time. It's the focused songwriting, the unbelievable wealth of great songs here. Karma Police, Lucky, Climbing Up the Walls, it just goes on and on. It's such a well-focused album, much like the Bends, just with a different sonic style. OK Computer had huge critical success and skyrocketed the band into stardom, pretty much. It's really worth checking out the video documentary, Meeting People is Easy, because it charts the frustration and the difficulty the band had at this all of a sudden universal acclaim, and that reaction that they had would prove a crucial point in their career. In '98, the band released the Airbag How Am I Driving EP, and in a way it foreshadows the next synthesis of the Radiohead sound in the way that the My Iron Lung EP did back in '94. It hints at what is to come. Polyethylene Parts 1 and Parts 2 is a great rocked up track that definitely fits alongside tracks on OK Computer, but then you need to listen to the track Melatonin, which is this electronic, frosty piece of music, and the only warmth that emanates from the entire track is Tom's vocals. So what was this sound foreshadowing exactly? Why, it was 2000's Kid A, of course. This period was relatively quiet for the band. There hadn't been much in the way of media coverage. They'd gone radio silent, pardon the pun, and there was a lot of difficulties internally. Tom was suffering from quite effective depression from the touring and the immediate success, and all the different band members had different ideas of what Radiohead was going to be moving into the new millennium. Apparently Ed had the idea to do a Back to Your Roots record, something that Tom squashed immediately. He had no interest in doing that, and Tom was more interested in pushing the experimental side of the band that had begun with OK Computer, utilising electronic instrumentation, different forms of expression that were moved away from that conventional rock format. In Tom's own words regarding the record, Kid A is like getting a massive eraser out and starting again. Oh, and before I go any further, I should probably point out that Kid A is a masterpiece. I mean, I don't even know if I need to say that. I think Kid A and OK Computer together have gone down as being landmark records of the past 20 years. They really do define the musical landscape in many ways, and they have for many different artists. But, you know, I should probably say it's a masterpiece. It really is a masterpiece. This record takes a much more minimalist approach. It utilises programmed electronic sequences, abstract lyrics, modular synthesizers, and essentially the freedom that digital manipulation had on their experimentation and their songwriting. Is there a more hypnotic, eerie opening track than Everything in Its Right Place? Johnny on the track. I think the song Everything in Its Right Place was important because, unlike with OK Computer, our last record, we were happy to leave parts of it empty. I think in the past we've been too scared to leave sounds exposed or to have too much space around them. And we've been guilty of layering on top of what's a very good song or a very good sound and hiding it, camouflaging it in case it's not good enough. And Everything in Its Right Place was one of the very first songs that we actually realised it's great, even if it's so sparse. So that was a very important song. And it also dictated how we sequenced the record, because we knew it had to be the first song, and everything just followed after it. The rounded synth sound with its dissonance alongside that 10/4 time signature, it offers up an unusual but a very irresistible sonic landscape, and Tom's voice floats above the track as if it's disembodied. During this time, Tom was writing lyrics by cutting up phrases, putting them in a hat and then picking them out at random, and that definitely explains some of those unconventional lyrical choices on this record. Yesterday I woke up sucking a lemon. There are two colours in my head. The new electronic influence opened up the band's songwriting in such an organic way. I mean, everything here is just unbelievable. The barraging fuzz bass and the punishing drum beat of the national anthem dissolving into a cacophony of processed waveforms and distorted, blaring horns. The heavy unease of Idiotech built with those synth swirls underneath that forward-pushed, sequenced beat, and Tom's vocals over the top. Who's in the bunker? Who's in the bunker? Women and children first. I have to talk about one of my favourite tracks of all time, the unparalleled How to Disappear Completely. The level of anguish and distress on this track is formidable, bursting with gorgeous string motifs that build and build to that inevitable conclusion. Tom wrote the lyrics about his struggle during the OK Computer tour, and that's where that anguish comes across. You can just hear it in those lyrics. That there, that's not me. I go where I please. I walk through walls. I float down the Liffey. I'm not here. This isn't happening. I'm not here. Kid A is my winter record. It's icy and soporific, which is propelled by that beautiful Stanley Donwood artwork of that sweeping, freezing vista. And the album, listening to the album, it's almost like dying of frostbite in this frozen wasteland, and just at the moment you're about to lose consciousness and the pain leaves you, you're able to accept your fate. It's there in that final line of Motion Picture Soundtrack. I will see you in the next life. But wow, this album, if you haven't ever listened to it, if by a small chance you've never heard this album before, you have to. Just please go and do it. Now, during the prolific sessions of Kid A, there was a wealth of material written and recorded, and that actually resulted in a second album being produced. So in June of 2001, we get Amnesiac. Please just bear in mind that this isn't some sort of B-side record for Kid A. This album is phenomenal. I like this album almost as much as Kid A. It's fantastic. Despite being recorded alongside Kid A tracks, Amnesiac is a very different album to its predecessor. It conjures a different feeling. I think a lot of that is down to the fact the electronics used in Kid A are in Amnesiac, but they're a little bit more subtle, a little less prominent. And I think that means that the album perhaps is a less immediate one, but it is just as rewarding as you start to get to know it. Okay, maybe more subtle apart from Polk Pull Revolving Doors and Like Spinning Plates, which is pulsating. Listen to those tracks. Opening track, Packed Like Sardines in a Crushed Tin Box. It opens with this deep sequenced bass hits and this very treated, distant snare pattern. And then eventually these warm synths just fill the space. It's one of Tom's most quoted lyrics, lilting in a subdued capacity. I'm a reasonable man, get off my case. Second track, Pyramid Song, has to be one of my top 5 Radiohead tracks. This is a masterpiece of a song, no question about it. The basis of the track is a beautifully constructed piano chord sequence, accompanied by these wailing strings and Phil's languorous drum beat. And the time signature of the track evokes this sort of spiraling dread, and it almost a feeling as if the track's going to slip away before you. Lyrically, I just love this track. It's inspired by ancient Egyptian culture after Tom visited an exhibition whilst on tour. All my lovers were there with me, all my past and futures, and we all went to heaven in a little rowboat. There was nothing to fear and nothing to doubt. Weirdly, Morning Bell, which was a Kid A track, appears here again in a slightly reworked fashion. Tom says that the song was included because it came from such a different place from the other version, because we only found it again by accident after having forgotten about it. Because it sounds like a recurring dream, it felt right. Closing track, Life in a Glass House, was recorded apart from the rest of the Kid A Amnesiac sessions, but oh, what a track. A syrupy, jazzy piece with that paranoid Radiohead sheen. The band enlisted an English trumpeter, Humphrey Lyttelton, to evoke that smoky, languid atmosphere. Another brilliant record, again, somehow. Also, not to be forgotten are the fantastic B-sides that come from the Amnesiac singles Knives Out and the Pyramid Song. You have the stormy, glitch ballad of Fog and the spine-chilling The Amazing Sounds of Orgy. You have to listen to them. In November 2001, I Might Be Wrong was released, which is a collection of live versions of Kid A and Amnesiac tracks. It's interesting to hear the way that the band tackle these tracks live. There's also a version of True Love Waits, which is a track that had been around since 1995, a track which we will consequently come to at the end of the video. So, next record is Hail to the Thief, Radiohead's 6th LP, released in June of 2003. Definitely my favourite of all the Donwood artworks. This is a stunning album cover. Here you go, have a look at it closer so you can bathe in its majesty. All the wordage you see there was collated from LA advertising found on roads and freeways. Again here, Donwood's playing with that idea of capitalism really taking over our world. This is Radiohead's political album, building on the governmental criticism of OK Computer track Electioneering and expanding on those fears of paranoia and depression. Tom's abstract lyricism is much more focused here on this album. He is angry and he has something to say. Even the album title refers to George Bush's narrow 2000 election win. And you know, all that terror that he seemed to like so much. Opening track 2 + 2 = 5 begins with guitar feedback. We can hear some studio clatter as Johnny plugs in and the track begins. And lyrically, this track is based on Orwell's 1984, a story where systematic oppression denies free thought. Are you such a dreamer to put the world to rights? I'll stay home forever, where 2 and 2 always makes a 5. I think once you hear the opener of 2 + 2 = 5, it becomes apparent that the approach to songwriting has changed once again. I mean, to start off with, the overdriven guitar is here again, which has largely been absent for the past few records. And so in that way, although the electric guitar doesn't become a core focus of the album's instrumentation, it's still there, and it engenders a more conventional feeling across the album. That's not to say it is a conventional album, because I don't think it is, and there's a lot of varied, creative, interesting songwriting techniques here. But it's certainly more rock than Amnesiac or Kid A. A lot of this is down to the recording process. This time they were trying to record as much as possible in live takes rather than relying heavily on overdubs. And the result of this actually speeds up the recording process drastically. And really, this has created another thrilling record. This is probably getting boring hearing at this point, but again, it's just another fantastic Radiohead record. Sail to the Moon is this record's pyramid song, a piano-led track that really emphasises the weight of the keys. I feel like you can almost feel them reverberating through your chest. This track is another example of the ability the band have in creating music that's simultaneously twinkly beautiful and ominous. A mesmeric combination of tones. There was Radiohead's most charted single since I think 1997. And it's a track that's typified by the clatter of Phil's tom rim hits and that rounded distortion of Johnny's guitar. I can't talk about this record without discussing Myxomatosis, an absolute belter of a track. Oh man, just thinking about that aggressive lead melody, the erratic drum pattern, Tom's tortured vocals. And I don't know why I feel so tongue-tied. Don't know why I feel so skinned alive. My thoughts are misguided and a little naive. I twitch and I salivate like with myxomatosis. You should put me in a home or you should put me down. I got myxomatosis. I got myxomatosis. Final track, A Wolf at the Door, is a fantastically unhinged track that ends this brilliant and powerful record. Interestingly, Hail to the Thief was actually leaked prior to release, and very frustrating for the band. They got pretty angry about it and they were fairly vocal about it. I mean, you would be, wouldn't you? As such, it's ended up being seen as a latter-day dark horse in the Radiohead discography in some ways, and even Tom himself has devised an alternative track listing that removes some of the tracks, it's suggesting that perhaps they believe that the way that Hail to the Thief was released is a little bit bloated and undefined, but personally, fuck that. I don't want an alternative track list because I like all the tracks here, and I don't want to lose tracks like A Punch Up at a Wedding and A Wolf at the Door. I've just heard this album so many times now that removing some of the songs and changing the track list just messes it all up for me, and I would personally rather listen to it in its original iteration. But maybe it's interesting. Maybe if you've never heard Hail to the Thief before, maybe it's worth checking out the alternative one that Tom recommends. I'll do a link below so you can find out what that alternative track list is. In 2004, Comlag was released, a great EP which again featured live tracks and some brilliant B-sides. Seriously, screw you guys, how can your B-sides be this good? Stick your headphones on and listen to the weirdly calming IDM-esque I Am Citizen Insane, or that alluring acoustic ballad Gagging Order. In 2006, Tom released his debut record The Eraser, which we don't have time to talk about here, but it is great. After the whole leaking debacle, the band decided to move away from EMI. I mean, at that point anyway, their 6-record album contract had finished, and as Tom so eloquently put, it probably would give us some perverse pleasure to say fuck you to this decaying business model. Oh boy, did they say fuck you as well. In 2007, via Dead Airspace, the band's website, they released their 7th LP, In Rainbows, records on a pay-what-you-want scheme. This created a huge ripple effect across the entire of the music industry, engendering conversations about whether this was going to change the way that people paid for and accessed music. I don't really want to talk about that too much because I find that it overshadows the conversation around the content of the actual album itself. And at the time, in 2007, once that conversation did die down, it became apparent that Radiohead had somehow constructed another masterpiece again. I talked about In Rainbows on my recent 10 favourite records video, so it's no secret that In Rainbows is my favourite Radiohead album. I mean, for me, Kid A and Amnesiac are very close behind, but In Rainbows just takes the cake. The biggest thing for me is the immense comfort I receive from this record. It's the warmth of the production and the organic nature of it. On this record, the band pretty much eschews the electronic instrumentation. Instead, producer Nigel Godrich focusing on things like the acoustic ambience of the drums. There's a little bit of fret buzz on Colin's bass. Tom's vocals seem like they're more breathy. You're just really aware that it's humans making this music. It's as if they're performing right in front of you. There's very little anger in Rainbows. It's in no way political, or at least doesn't feel that way to me. It very much explores the idea of transience. It starts in one place and ends somewhere completely different. That quote, I think, reveals a kind of maturity in the band's songwriting and their approach, and that's not in any way a dig at the earlier songwriting, like that's immature or something, because that's not what I mean. But when you listen to this album, there just seems like there's an implicit understanding in what life is, the beauty, but also the god-awfulness of it too. Opener 15 Step plays with you a little bit because the opening is this sequenced drum sample. You think this is going to be more of an electronic sounding track before that these stunning guitar and bass melodies cascade into the track. It's like a ray of sunshine across your closed eyes. Nude is a brittle, tragic track. It originally was called Big Ideas Don't Get Any, and it's been around and it's existed in live form since about 1997, so it's become a bit of a fan favourite. And in fact, that is a big thing about Radiohead's discography. Often they have written a song which comes from a much earlier era, and it doesn't get fitted into a studio album until years and years later, like Nude, for example. The relationship between the dry drum production, Colin's intuitive bass line, and the wandering guitar lines create a gorgeous layer of sound that cushions Tom's vocals, which are perhaps at their most bruised. Now that you've found it, it's gone. Now that you feel it, you don't. You've gone off the rails. So don't get any big ideas. They're not gonna happen. You'll go to hell for what your dirty mind is thinking. Next track, Weird Fish's Arpeggi, is an otherworldly butterfly of a track. It's winging its way through the sunshine before this outro appears like a cloud and suffuses the atmosphere, strings swelling underneath the band. Seventh track, Reckoner, has to be mentioned for its radiant middle eight, with more striking string lines as Tom sings, "Because we separate, like ripples on a black shore." Final track, Videotape, is for me one of Radiohead's defining artistic statements, a lamentation on death and legacy in the poetic metaphor of leaving a videotape behind for your loved ones after you die. This is one for the good days, and I have it all here in red, blue, green. You are my center while I spin away, out of control, on videotape. The piano, along with Tom's painfully revealing lyrics, are an intensely cathartic way to end one of the most humanistic, contemplative albums ever. Wow. And that's not even it either, because we've got In Rainbows Disc 2, which is a collection of B-sides from the sessions formulated into an 8-track album. And whilst it doesn't flow in the same way that In Rainbows does, it's not nearly as good. It's still full of fantastic tracks. Check out the funereal Go Slowly or the grotty Wig Out Bangers and Mash featuring Tom on drums. The following year, the band released In Rainbows from the Basement, which was a live session filmed and recorded, and it's a really great opportunity to see the band perform these tracks from In Rainbows. I think it just further pushes that humanistic feeling you get when you listen to the album itself. It's also really worth watching for Tom going batshit crazy on Bangers and Mash, and also for Ed's adorable Smile singing. So here comes the most contentious and fan-divisive part of Radiohead's discography, 2011's The King of Limbs. The release for this record was altogether very different from the media-heavy coverage of Hail to the Thief and In Rainbows. On the 14th of February, which is Valentine's Day, we got an announcement via Dead Airspace that an album would be released on the Saturday, and then we actually got it a day earlier on the Friday. It was a low-key affair, which actually is fitting for this record because it is a low-key album. It's less impactful than a lot of the other Radiohead releases. The band wanted to do something different again with regards to their songwriting process. Johnny explains. We didn't want to pick up guitars and write chord sequences. We didn't want to sit in front of a computer either. We wanted a third thing, which involved playing and programming. This is the thought process that led to The King of Limbs, an album of textures and cycles, circadian rhythms and loops. Ed himself talks about the way the record emphasises the rhythmic playing of Phil and Colin. Rhythm is the king of limbs. The rhythm dictates the record. It's very important. It's in this way that The King of Limbs occupies a strange space sonically. It's unfailingly rhythmic, yet it's restrained by its own design. There are no peaks and troughs. There's an unwavering line of consistency which, into the second half of the record, dips into a calmer atmosphere, but that's very different to the peaks and troughs of the other Radiohead records. Opening track Bloom loops Tom's piano pattern until drums and guitar loops come in to occupy the space. The track is very sparse and cold until Colin's bass line comes in and warms everything up. It's a hypnotic track for sure, and I feel like if it was double the length, I still wouldn't get bored of its captivating grain of rhythms. Morning Mr. Magpie operates in a very similar way. You have that muted guitar melody interweaving with Colin's agile bass and Phil's looped drum rhythms. You have adding and subtracting ambient layers of sound and converging vocal samples. Now this is where much of the criticism around The King of Limbs lies. They don't like the looped approach to the songwriting. They find the recordings quite flat, and that was my initial opinion on the record when I first heard it in 2011, because nothing captures you on a first listen like the way previous Radiohead records do. The album just sort of unfurls and then closes up again. But this is the great thing about The King of Limbs. If you listen to it a few more times, those melodies, those textures, those rhythms start to open up to you, and something that initially feels a little bit monotone all of a sudden breaks into colour. This becomes most apparent on the second half of the album, so the final 4 tracks, they have like a humane warmth to them that the first half of the album purposefully forgoes. The incredibly catchy Lotus Flowers, a track I had on endless repeat once it finally clicked for me. That massaging bass line, the rich synths as Tom sings in the chorus. Slowly we unfurl as lotus flowers, 'cause all I want is the moon upon a stick, just to see what if, just to see what is. I can't kick your habit, just to feed your fast ballooning head. Listen to your heart. The looping used on Codex, Give Up the Ghost and Separator is far more subtle than the first 4 tracks on the record, and in that way the record goes on a kind of a journey, because you go from the harsh affront of circadian rhythm in the first 4 tracks, and then it's just a gentle heartbeat in the background towards the end of Separator as it fades out. And on that final fade of Separator where Tom sings, "If you think this is over, then you're wrong," it threw all of us fans into an insane frenzy because we thought we were getting The King of Limbs Part 2, but we didn't. What I'm trying to say about The King of Limbs is I think it is a worthy album in Radiohead's discography. If you've dismissed it up until this point, I think you need to give it more time, because as we move further and further away from The King of Limbs as a release, I think it proves its place in their discography. It is a really good album. So although we didn't get a part 2 to The King of Limbs, we did get some other tracks released that were recorded during the King of Limbs session, so The Daily Mail and Staircase. You can see, when you listen to them, you'll be able to see why they weren't included. Staircase feels like such a different track. Although it's very rhythmic, similar to King of Limbs, stylistically it just sounds so different. It would have been really out of place on the King of Limbs. And then you also have The Daily Mail, which is a brilliant track. It's kind of an anomaly. It probably could sit anywhere else in the Radiohead period of tracks. I could definitely easily have heard that track during the Hail to the Thief era, for example. But yeah, listen to that, it's great. Oh yeah, we also got Super Collider and The Butcher. To be honest, they're 2 tracks that I really don't get in Radiohead's discography. I find them very boring, and they feel like true B-sides, because Radiohead's B-sides are pretty fantastic usually. They're like most bands' A-sides, but yeah, Super Collider and The Butcher, I don't think much of them. But let me know if you like them, and let's have a discussion about it. In August of 2011, the band returned with another From the Basement session, this time King of Limbs From the Basement. For me, a far more impactful release than the In Rainbows one. As much as I liked the In Rainbows one, there's something about the From the Basement King of Limbs that it changes the way you approach the King of Limbs tracks. You might be able to appreciate the songwriting on that album a little bit more if you watch the band perform these pieces live. You have the addition of Clive Deemer on drums as well, so there's 2 drums, which really adds to that rhythmic feeling of the record. Definitely worth a look. Go and check that out. I'm just going to ignore the King of Limbs remix 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 album. That is actually the title, because to me it's just an endless collection of the same tracks remixed over and over again, and nothing on that release stands out to me at all. You might feel differently. Let me know if there are any standouts that you think should be mentioned on the remix album, but I personally wouldn't bother. So, after touring the King of Limbs, to which I was lucky enough to attend one of the London dates, Radiohead goes radio silent once again. Each band member goes off and works on their own side projects for a couple of years. Details and hints started to make their way online in 2015, hinting to fans that there was an imminent release, and we were just constantly being blueballed because every time someone came up with some ridiculous fan theory, it didn't turn out to be true, so we were just waiting for any tidbit of information. Probably the greatest signifier of Radiohead fan obsession is the At Ease message board, which during 2015 and early 2016 was absolute insanity. People just searching for all these clues and just logging on all the time. There was so much activity, bearing in mind there was no coherent clues or no real signifiers from the band that anything was coming out. It was just ramping up every single day, and it was quite a funny thing to be involved in. On Christmas Day, Radiohead released the song Spectre on SoundCloud. This was a track that was originally meant for the Bond film of the same name, but the sumptuous strings and the dramatic energy of this track had fans speculating that perhaps this was what was going to be coming. This was a sign of things to come on the next album release. And boy did we speculate. Well, finally on the 8th of May, Sunday evening, a moon-shaped pool was released. It's strange talking about this record in depth because I'm still actually assimilating it into the discography, despite it being out for almost a year at this point. That's just what I do with this band's music. I live with it, and my opinions change over time to what the music means to me and what the music signifies. But despite it being early days, relatively speaking, I can attest to the fact that A Moon-Shaped Pool is another brilliant record. In some ways, it harkens back to the songwriting of In Rainbows, although this album once again carves out a very different sonic atmosphere. The music here is somehow iridescent. It's mysterious and beautiful in equal measure, and I feel like each track shimmers unlike anything else in the band's discography. Opening track Burn the Witch is a startling opening, beginning with that allegro string section before electronic bass and drums joins. It sounds quite optimistic, but there's that edge of foreboding unease created by the lyricism of the track. Stay in the shadows. Cheer at the gallows. This is a roundup. This is a low-flying panic attack. The track eventually dissolves into a cacophony of angular strings. The dissonance rings out. And initially when I heard the track, I felt that it stood apart from the rest of the album, but in retrospect, now I've heard the album so many times, I feel like it really sets up the opalescent mood of the album really well. Second track, Daydreaming, is an absolute gem, typifying that glittering sound with its layers of ambience and synth flutters and Tom's crooning. Dreamers. They never learn. They never learn. Beyond the point of no return, of no return. Then it's too late. The damage is done. The damage is done. The lyricism appears to refer to Plato's allegory of the cave, which is a really fascinating concept that you should read up on, and I think you can see the track mirrors it really nicely, not just in the lyricism, but in the sonic landscape of the track as well. I'll do a link down below for that. Once again, somehow we have an album with no weak points. I mean, the track The Numbers is an almost pastoral anthem calling for action against climate change. It has this rousing string section in the second verse. It's a really sumptuous track. Identikit's a track that's been around for a few years now. They played it on the King of Limbs tour in 2012, and it's a real fantastic groover of a track with this transcendent chorus. You have the guitar and the drums spidering around Tom's vocal line. He's singing Broken Hearts, Make It Rain. It's a really brilliant live track. I'll do a link below for them playing that one. And for the closing track of the final Radiohead LP release, for now, hopefully, we get True Love Waits, an absolute fan favourite from 1995 that feels like a big thank you to everybody for all the support and love over the years. The instrumentation was removed from acoustic guitar to piano, and it's a lot less jangly now and a lot more meditative, and the result of that is it's one of the saddest songs Radiohead have ever released. I'll drown my beliefs to have your babies. I'll dress like your niece and wash your swollen feet. Just don't leave. Don't leave. This track, along with the rest of the record, has been framed by some as a response to Tom splitting up with his long-term partner of 23 years, Rachel Owen. And you can hear that through a lot of the lyricism. What's even sadder is that in December of 2016, Rachel actually died, and she'd been suffering from cancer for quite a long time. That just adds so much more of an emotional resonance to this record, because not only could these lyrics be about the loss of a partnership with someone, but also about the physical loss of that person and a realization you're never going to see that person again. You know, it makes this album so much more emotionally crushing, and I think it really develops this album as the most emotionally intense Radiohead album. A really sad note to end on, unfortunately, but Radiohead are the kind of band that creates music that instills intense emotions. Their music is incredibly cathartic, and it's the reason that people are so receptive to their music and love their music as much as they do. It's the reason there is such an impassioned fan base around Radiohead's music, because people like myself, we really connect to this music, and they're a band that are unlike any other, and I will follow them till the end of the earth, or till whenever they finish making music. That's it for my Radiohead guide. I've covered lots of stuff here, but I'm sure I've missed out a few different things. I know for a fact I didn't talk about Harry Patch in memory of, and I can't go back again now. And there'll be other stuff that I haven't talked about because of time constraints. But if I've left anything out you think I should have included, make sure you write it in the comment section below. Talk about your favourite Radiohead albums. It's another guide that I've really enjoyed making, and I'll see you soon.